Scottish history is full with tales and stories of giants, beings far taller and stronger than the average clansman. Many a brave fighter or strong warrior would claim to be descended from these mythical creatures. But as with all things, the time of the giants would come to an end, and there is some that would say the last giants of Scottish blood lived in the land of Ross, the cave of the last giants. North of Inverness, in the land of Ross, among the hills of Fearn, there was a great cave, which was the home to the last giant and his daughter. In the culture of giants, a marriage between a giant and mortal was looked at in quite a negative light. The giants thought themselves to be above man in not only stature, but also importance. So it was with a heavy heart that the last giant blessed the marriage of his daughter to a local man. On the day of their marriage, the bride and groom, both in their clan tartan, tore strips from the plaid, and joining them together, they tied the knot, as was the custom at the time. The occasion was a small affair with only 5 or 6 guests. The ceremony was successful, but then came the feast. There were great piles of cooked ox and boar, the table near overflowing with cakes, bread, fruit, and all manner of delicious food. The meal was prepared by the groom. It was his attempt to win favour with his new father-in-law. "Let's eat," called the groom. They had all sat down at a large table to begin the meal. When the groom asked, "Have you giants ever eaten from an ox as large as this one?" The last giant slowly rose to his full height and said to the man, "Among us giants, the legs of birds we would hunt and eat were far larger and heavier than your small ox." The groom could not control himself and burst into fits of laughter. "Do you take me for a fool?" spoke the groom. "There is no such bird. I think your great age and blindness would account for such a ridiculous tale." The giant, now angered, would not let this offence go. For a lowly mortal to dare suggest a giant of his lineage and nobility was a liar was unheard of. Though he was old and blind, the giant was determined to vindicate himself. He called to his manservant and ordered him to bring his bow and 3 arrows. The daughter tried to persuade him to return to the feast and forgive the groom for what must have been some form of mistake. But the last giant would not hear of it. Within moments, the servant returned with a bow well over 10 foot in length and 3 arrows that would be considered spears in any man's arsenal. On seeing the enormous bow, the man began to worry. The giant ordered his servant to guide him out of the cave and deep into the Balnagowan forest. As the odd pair entered the woodland, the giant began to give directions to his servant. Although he could not see, he possessed a great memory. Eventually, the giant, led by the servant, entered the clearing. "Do you see a large rock with rushes at its base?" questioned the giant. "That I do," said the servant. "Perfect," replied the giant. "Guide me to the large step on the rock." The servant then completed his master's request. And now that the pair were standing upon the rock, the servant could see that the sky was filled with all manner of birds, many of which he had never laid eyes upon before. "Can you see the birds?" asked the giant. "Are they larger than common?" "I can see them," voiced the servant in astonishment. "The skies are black with birds, some far larger than the biggest eagle I have ever seen, but the largest is 3 times bigger than an ox." There was a subtle smile which crept upon the giant's lips. "Guide my hand to my bow," he said. With bow in hand, knocked one of his spear-like arrows. He stood in complete silence for a while, as if listening to the movements of the birds. Then he held the bow high, and with his immense strength, took the string to full draw, and loosed an arrow. It shot through the air with incredible speed and landed directly in the breast of the largest bird. Like a rock, it fell from the sky and landed in the clearing. It was huge and far too heavy for the servant to move. He did his duty and guided his master to the bird. With one of the giant's great arms, he lifted the bird and swung it over his shoulder, and with the other was led from the woods. The pair returned to the cave and entered with their catch. The groom was wide-eyed and entirely mystified by the mere sight of the enormous creature. The giant, without saying a word, threw the gargantuan bird upon the table in front of his doubtful son-in-law. The groom quickly fell to his knees in front of the giant and repented for his foul treatment of his aged and blinded father-in-law. The last giant of Scotland, now fully vindicated, returned to the feast. It is said that from that day, the groom would only show the giant the utmost respect and deference. He understood that the giants of old knew far more about this land than he ever would. The cave, now sadly empty, still lies among the hills of Fearn, and is still remembered as the home of the last giant in Scotland. Thank you for listening.